After the outsized performance of Quebec and the rest of New France in Part 2, when we covered King William's War, leveraging more cohesive organization, extensive fortifications, and working closely with their Wabanaki allies to bring the fight to the English, the French had suddenly become more of a threat than previously reckoned in the New World. Political events in Europe following the succession of the Spanish Empire had allied New France and New Spain for the ensuing war, which would pit them against the various English colonies. In Part 3, we'll cover Queen Anne's War to the end of King George's War. I covered the background of the War of Spanish Succession at the end of the last video so that we can get right into the war's American theater, known to the English colonists as Queen Anne's War, continuing the tradition of naming their wars after the reigning monarch. The French took a more metric approach, simply calling it the Second Intercolonial War, while the European colonists and their native allies couldn't really care less who was the King of Spain, except for maybe the ones in New Spain. The war was their opportunity to settle scores left behind in the north by King William's War. While this is a video on New France, it isn't all about Quebec, and the French would involve themselves in the southern colonies portion of the war too, founding the colony of Louisiana at about the same time war were declared in 1702, with the construction of Fort Louis de la Louisiane, north of present-day Mobile, Alabama. In a similar fashion to King William's War, this war had been preceded by a pre-war war. This time, the Spanish in Florida jumped the gun, with the governor of Spanish Florida, José de Zuniga y la Cerda, on the urging of the founder of Louisiana and now ally Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville, armed some 800 Appalachian warriors. These Appalachians were recruited from the Spanish mission San Luis de Appalachie in present-day Tallahassee, Florida, and were led by Don Francisco Romo de Urzia. The Appalachians were not a monolith, and word spread quickly of the warband's intentions to attack the English in Carolina, reaching the English trading partners, the Creek Muskogee, at Hittiche, where Carolina trader Anthony Dodsworth was doing business. Dodsworth was able to organize a response from the tribes friendly to the Carolinians, and rallied with 500 warriors, with the blessing of the Muskogee Miko Hoboletli, known to the English as Emperor Brim. Dodsworth and Urzia were believed to have left their respective camps of Hittiche near Macon, Georgia, and Mission San Luis on the same day, October 7th. The Appalachians came upon the Creek camp somewhere on the Flint River in western Georgia on or before October 18th and commenced a pre-dawn ambush. Predicting the Appalachians would do this, Dodsworth and his allies laid a trap, making their camp appear to be occupied by sleeping warriors. The men lay in wait around the camp. When Urzia and his allies came charging in, Dodsworth and his warriors began firing on them. The Appalachians were taken completely by surprise and quickly routed, with most killed and a few captured, with Urzia falling back to the Appalachian town of Pacacua with only 300 warriors. Shortly after this Battle of Flint River, the official news that the War of Spanish Succession had begun would reach all parties. To put a bow on this Florida theater, James Moore, colonial governor of Carolina, led a force between 800 or 1,200 to St. Augustine, Florida, laying siege to and razing all but the main fortress. Moore sent for Jamaican reinforcements, but Zuniga's reinforcements from Cuba arrived first, causing Moore to abandon the siege. Moore and his native allies, namely the Creek Confederacy, The Yamasee Confederacy and the Chickasaw spent the next few years massacring the Appalachee, Choctaw, and Timucua, to the point the Appalachee became extinct as a people, and the Timucua never really recovered from this war. The Carolinians and their allies continued to harry Louisiana before an English privateer raided the colony's main harbor, Port Dauphin, before a flood caused the settlers to abandon La Mobile and the associated Fort Louis de la Louisiane in favor of the current site of Mobile 20 miles downriver. In the north, the Canadians and their Wabanaki allies returned to the tried-and-true strategy of punitive raiding expeditions against the English settlers in the disputed Maine borderlands, leading to simultaneous attacks on August 10, 1703 against the settlements of Wells, Cape Porpoise, Saco, Scarborough, and the villages that made up modern-day Cape Elizabeth and Portland. These attacks are known as the Northeast Coast Campaign, but remembered in New England as the Six Terrible Days. And while the French and Wabanaki did kill a lot of settlers, their main objective was to capture high-value targets, specifically people they could use to exchange prisoners for or to ransom. To this end, the French and their allies led a daring raid on Deerfield, Massachusetts. This raid, or massacre, saw 50 of the settlers killed and over 100 captured, with more dying or being killed on the long march back to Montreal. The Deerfield raid is what finally got Boston to respond. Once again, Benjamin Church, now a colonel, was commissioned to lead a counteroffensive. Church had meticulously planned his response, and started by raiding Fort Pentagaut at Castin, even capturing Jean Vincent St. Castin's daughter, before moving on to St. Stephen in modern New Brunswick, Grand Prix, and what would later be Windsor and Falmouth in Nova Scotia, as well as the settlements on the Isthmus of Chignecto. In addition to Castin's daughter, Church also captured Noel Douiron during the raid on Pisiquid, later renamed Falmouth. Douiron would play a part over 50 years later when the Acadians would be deported from Acadia during the 7 Years' War. Importantly, Noel would meet his wife in Boston while the two were in prison during the war. In May 1701, the Yankees began the first of 3 attempts to capture Port Royal, the first 2 failing before being answered by the French with an ambitious attempt at another 6 terrible days, this time focusing on the New Hampshire settlements on the Piscataqua River, but refusal from the native allies instead resulted in a raid on Haverhill, Massachusetts on August 29, 1708. The raid elicited a response from the governor of Massachusetts, Francis Nicholson, who led 2,000 regular and provincial troops with support from the Royal Navy, beginning the final siege of Port Royal, with the Royal Marines taking the settlement on October 6th, and the fortifications surrendering under heavy bombardment by October 12th, formally capturing and renaming the settlement to Annapolis Royal on October 16th. Though the French had lost the peninsular portion of Acadia, the Wabanaki continued to wage a highly effective guerrilla war in the British-occupied areas, as well as Maine. These actions culminated in the Battle of Bloody Creek in June 1711, where a band of Micmac defeated a small occupying force of provincial militia just north of Annapolis Royal. The victory emboldened the French and the Wabanaki to attempt to recapture Annapolis, though their attempt was defeated by the arrival of reinforcements from New England. In New York and Quebec, this war was less intense than King William's War, with little actual fighting taking place between the French and English colonists, or their Iroquois allies, much to the chagrin of the latter. A handful of expeditions from New York never really resulted in anything, due to lack of support from Britain in favor of shoring up Portugal. The Haudenosaunee refused to commit any offensives without British support by sea. In an attempt to remedy this situation and get support from the British, Francis Nicholson, Peter Schuyler, and King Hendrick, a pro-English Mohawk leader, went to England and met with Queen Anne to ask for assistance, which they were successful in getting. The British and Haudenosaunee planned an attack on Quebec in a similar mold to the previous attack during King William's War, with forces from New York attacking Montreal by land and forces going by sea, this time though, the British regulars and Royal Navy making up the bulk of soldiers attacking Quebec. In June 1711, 5,000 British troops under Admiral Hovenden Walker arrived in Boston, doubling the city's population, consequently straining resources and the tempers of the Bostonians. The city hosted and supplied these troops and their sailors until the arrival of 15 ships of the line at the end of July, when the expedition finally set sail for Quebec. Admiral Walker's forces seemed to be cursed. Reaching the mouth of the St. Lawrence in heavy fog, the admiral ordered the fleet to move upriver. Consequently, 8 troop transports foundered on rocks on what is now known as Point aux Anglais, killing upwards of 900 soldiers and sailors. Such fatalities caused Admiral Walker to abandon the expedition, which continued to suffer losses even in retreat, with 4 ships running aground at Cape Breton, and Walker's flagship HMS Edgar suffering an explosion due to improperly handled gunpowder. HMS Edgar retained this curse, burning up later that year while anchored in Portsmouth, Hampshire. At the same time as Walker's fleet left Boston, the land portion of the expedition, led by Governor Nicholson, departed Albany for Montreal. Nicholson's men were camped at Lake George when the news of Walker's failure reached them. Nicholson was reportedly so mad that in a fit of rage tore off his wig and threw it on the ground before ordering the expedition to retreat. The failure of this expedition was just another nail in the coffin for the English-Iroquois relations. French-leaning Mohawks began passing information to New France and even assisted the French in their raids on New England. This was perceived as more inaction on the English's part and further soured the Haudenosaunee opinion of their ally. The failure of the expedition also caused friction between the British and the colonists, the British blaming the failure on the colonists not providing enough aid and support to the expedition, and the colonists blaming Admiral Walker's incompetence. Later, during King George I's reforms, Walker would be stripped of his rank in 1715, validating Boston's opinion. The problems that arose between the citizens of Boston and the British troops using the city as a staging area echoed sentiments that would be more prevalent during the British occupation immediately preceding the Revolution. One officer under Brigadier General John Hill, commenting in his journal while in Boston that the ill nature and sourness of these people, whose government, doctrine, and manners, whose hypocrisy and canting are all unsupportable, further speculating that if the crown did not bring the colonists to heel, that they would grow more stiff and disobedient every day. Britain and France came to an armistice, signing a preliminary peace in London in October 1711. By 1712, all parties to the war entered negotiations. Specifically pertaining to North America, France ceded the Nova Scotia Peninsula portion of Acadia, their claims to Newfoundland, the Hudson Bay, as well as the island of St. Kitts to Britain, and though Spain retained Florida, the colony would never recover from the Carolinian and Creek raids, which broke their mission system and scattered their native allies. While unlike King William's War, which ended things unresolved, Queen Anne's War was a major blow to New France, which lost the lucrative fur grounds around the Hudson Bay. A problem would also rise later in Acadia for the British, as the majority population was French, or their Wabanaki allies. Speaking of the Wabanaki, they suddenly find their territory in a much less defensible position than before, with not only a border with Maine, but now Nova Scotia. Speaking of the border with Maine, the separate Wabanaki English Treaty of Portsmouth would fail to address the border dispute between what remained of Acadia and the Massachusetts colony of Maine, and only restored English claims in Maine. It would be a separate war, Father Rale's War, that would set the border of Maine and destabilize French control in the region. From the end of Queen Anne's War and the next major war, sparked this time by the War of Austrian Succession, French Canada and Acadia saw unprecedented growth. The agricultural and fishing projects of Jean Talon, which had failed to take hold in the 17th century, began to really bear fruit in the 18th, with massive natural population growth. 1717 was a landmark year for New France, with the founding of an admiralty court in Quebec City, which had jurisdiction over the most populated portions of New France, minus Louisbourg, the main settlement of Cape Breton Island, and Louisiana, who administered the Illinois country, all land southwest of the Great Lakes, from the settlements at the mouth of the Mississippi. By 1720, New France was by all accounts a self-sustaining colony, with a population of nearly 25,000. With the loss of the Hudson Bay, fur trapping moved west. Montreal became a center of commerce and a hotbed for the fur market in the first half of the 18th century. Montreal grew precipitously in this time period, developing a unique Canadian culture separate from Quebec City. In response to the increased population, which doubled every decade, the Superior Council began a road project that would begin construction in 1737. The Chemin de Roi, or King's Highway, would connect Quebec City west to Montreal, ending at what was then the small village of Repentigny, Quebec, just off the lower tip of Montreal Island. The King's Highway was, at 170 miles long, the longest road in Canada and the second longest road north of Mexico, after the completion of its American counterpart, the King's Highway connecting Boston to Charleston, which was finished just before in 1735. That said, the Chemin de Roi, at 27 feet wide, would have been much more user-friendly, and it would have been far easier to sail or take a small boat to your destination in America than to try and paddle up the St. Lawrence, as opposed to take the new road to Montreal. The number of coureurs de bois and voyageurs, as well as natives coming to do business in Montreal, in addition to competition from the English and Russians, caused fur prices to decline swiftly in Europe, causing economic hardships in Canada and the Upper Louisiana Territory by the middle of the century. The French crown had other reasons besides economic to encourage settlement on the Mississippi River and its tributaries, namely, to frustrate the English. the British colonies on the east coast of America were a clear and present growing threat to France and its world hegemony. If the British were able to break past the Appalachian Mountains and into the interior, it was feared they could bring the whole of the boundless continent to bear against France, forever shifting power not only in Europe, but the whole world. To prevent this, the French planned to hem in the American colonials, first by constructing forts in the Appalachian backcountry, second by increasing the population of French subjects in these areas to actually defend the fortifications, and third to make allies with as many natives as possible. While the construction of fortifications was going well, and the relations with natives was progressing, the French, as was with Quebec, simply couldn't get French men and women to move to the New World, and those that did were of a less than reputable or reliable sort. When the colonial governors of Louisiana relocated from Biloxi to the new settlement of La Nouvelle Orleans in 1722, they complained incessantly about the character of the settlers, often rough and tumble coureurs de bois, gold prospectors, deported galley slaves, and soon imported African slaves. The peace and good times couldn't last forever, though, as was the nature of early modern European politics. A new war needed to be fought. Last time, the War of Spanish Succession pitted a branch of the Habsburgs against each other, with a little more than help from France. This time, Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor, who before his ascent to emperor attempted to assert his legal claim over Spain, sparking the War of Spanish Succession, died himself without a legal male heir. Charles died on October 20th, 1740, leaving behind only 2 daughters, the most relevant to the story being the eldest daughter, Archduchess Maria Theresa, who was married to the Duke of Lorraine, Francis Stephen, which was at the time under German rule, but is now, after a series of events, firmly in France. While at the outset of the war the couple had no male heir, by 1741, with the birth of Joseph, their claim to the Holy Roman Empire was set in stone. The other contender was Prince-Elector of Bavaria, Charles, who claimed the Holy Roman Empire through his marriage to Maria Amalia, the daughter of Joseph I, who was succeeded by his younger brother Charles IV, Maria Theresa's father. What's more, the couple had an adult male heir in Maximilian, who in a generation would have caused a second Austrian War of Succession, as he would later die heirless, which caused the War of Bavarian Succession. As both had an equally good claim, there was once again only one way to decide things, and the American colonies found themselves once more at war. Similar to the last time, New France and New Spain found themselves allies against the British colonies, but their wars were separate to the colonists, who called the war with New France King George's War, and the war with Spain the War of Jenkins' Ear. Jenkins' Ear was another one of those pre-war wars, so named for an English sea captain who had allegedly had his ear cut off by Spanish authorities searching his ship for contraband nearly a decade earlier in 1731. That said, the Spanish name for it, the War of Agreement, I think better suits the conflict than England's flimsy Jenkins' Ear casus belli. Regardless, it was located to mostly the Caribbean and privateer actions against shipping lanes, and pretty much over by 1742. That war had little to no bearing on New France or the English colonies in North America, as Florida was still largely devastated from the last war and showed no real threat to the southern colonies. It took until 1744 for the British to officially enter the war on the side of Austria, though a battle did take place before any formal declarations. The pro-war parliamentary faction mostly acted out of fear that another French succession victory would permanently align Europe against Britain, though a second factor being that King George II was also still the Elector of Hanover, a realm within the Holy Roman Empire. The Hanoverian rulers were afraid of the real possibility that their lands would be conquered and pushed for Parliament to join the war, even taking an army to Hanover without consulting Parliament and engaging the French in the Battle of Dittingen on June 27, 1743, with a formal declaration following in March of 1744. New France was the first to receive news of France and Britain's formal declaration of war, with word reaching the fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island on May 3, 1744, who quickly set about preparing to attack Annapolis Royal. The Catholic priest and vicar general for Acadia, Jean-Louis Le Loutre, called upon the Micmac and Malecite, who sent 300 warriors. The first of the warriors to arrive in Louisbourg raided the nearby British outpost of Canso on the northeasternmost point of Nova Scotia. The warband was delayed until July, waiting for more warriors to attack Annapolis, costing them not only the element of surprise on the defending garrison, but as well time to prepare for a New England counterattack. While the French did get the drop on the British, it was only by a few weeks, as on June 2nd the proclamation of war reached Boston. Father Le Loutre led his native allies and less than 100 French and Acadian soldiers to Annapolis Royal, reaching the settlement on July 12th, and began laying siege to the main fortification of Fort Anne. The first siege lasted only 4 days, with the warband retreating when 70 reinforcements arrived from Boston. The French had only ransacked the town and killed more cattle than soldiers, with 2 casualties suffered by the defenders, while several Malecite were killed during the fighting. There were 3 more sieges, the next taking place in August, and while the casualties got bigger with each engagement, the French never managed to recapture Port Royal. Starting on May 12, 1745, the British began a siege of their own, using the ransacked Canso as a base. 4,200 American troops from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, with support from the other American colonies and Royal Navy warships, laid siege to Louisbourg. The Americans were of a peculiar morale. Louisbourg was seen by the Yankees as a wretched hive of scum and villainy, called the American Dunkirk for its prolific privateer activity. Many of the soldiers present for the invasion and fighting were personally affected, having lost family to pirates based out of Louisbourg. This was demonstrated when, upon immediately landing, the troops stormed the northeast harbor, what is today the actual town of Louisbourg, Nova Scotia, which caused the garrison holding the Royal Battery to flee, not bothering to spike their guns or even set off their powder. A key factor helping the New Englanders was the garrison of Louisbourg had been neglected, underpaid, and undersupplied, thus were relying on a promised supply mission from Acadia. The defenders of Louisbourg endured nearly 6 weeks of siege, holding out for the reinforcements and supplies that were due to arrive by the end of July. Unfortunately for the garrison, the relief fleet was interdicted by New England ships off Tatamagouche, Nova Scotia, on June 26th. News of the fleet's destruction reached the defenders the next day, and the garrison surrendered. In response to the defeat at Louisbourg, the Wabanaki began another northeastern coast campaign, raiding New England settlements throughout the summer. The next year, a full expedition was launched to recapture Louisbourg, but was battered by storms, and an outbreak of typhus and scurvy derailed the whole endeavor. When Admiral Jean-Baptiste de Royce, Duc d'Anville, succumbed to typhus in the Chebucto Bay off of Halifax, his first officer turned the whole fleet around and returned to France. After the failure to recapture Louisbourg, the French and their allies changed focus to attacking New York and New England. On August 27, 1745, 600 French and Allied troops razed Saratoga, New York, capturing upwards of 100 settlers and destroying the settlement. The next July, a force of Haudenosaunee, New York militia, and British regulars gathered north of Albany for a counterattack. When the regulars failed to arrive, the counterattack dissolved, and once more the Iroquois were offended. The French as well amassed a large force to counter this reported mass of troops, and planned a counter-invasion of the Hudson River Valley. Once it was seen that the British attack had failed, the French turned their attention to a less defended target and began attacking the settlements along the Hoosick River in northwestern Massachusetts. Governor William Shirley had previous to this spurred a hasty attempt to strengthen western Massachusetts with a chain of fortifications scattered throughout the Berkshires, centering on Fort Massachusetts in present-day North Adams. The garrison defending the fort, undersupplied and already racked with disease, surrendered after holding out for one day once the full extent of the French force came to bear on the fort. Large raids continued, with a devastating raid on Grand Pré, Nova Scotia, taking place in February 1747, and a raid on Schenectady, New York in 1748, with low-level violence not uncommon in the frontier and formerly French areas. When the War of Austrian Succession came to an end with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, signed on October 18, 1748, King George's War had ended status quo ante bellum. The British had traded Louisbourg for Madras in India, which it had lost to France during the course of the Indian theater of the war. The treaty was disliked in Britain, but the Americans were incensed. All they got from the treaty, from the lives sacrificed, particularly to, that they believed, permanently stamp out the American Dunkirk, was a commission that would negotiate boundary disputes between New France and the British colonies. And though they didn't know it yet, the Americans also lost something more important: their Haudenosaunee allies. Just as with King William's War, King George's War left deep enmities between not only the American and Canadian colonists, but any goodwill gained by the British and Wabanaki was gone. The Acadians on Nova Scotia too rose up and attacked their British neighbors. This would lead to drastic consequences within the next decade. The war had also placed another straw on the Americans' back. If the British were willing to betray their safety, returning Louisbourg for some far-flung possession they probably didn't even know about, what else would they do at America's expense? The French, too, were confronted with a problem. Their small population forced them to rely too heavily on force multipliers like fortifications and their native allies. But the defeat at Louisbourg demonstrated that, in the face of the Royal Navy and the sheer number of Americans, their present fortifications and allies weren't enough, and began a campaign to fortify the contested Ohio country and court new, better allies in the West. In the next part, we will follow New France into its next series of wars, the expulsion of the Acadians, and the ultimate defeat of the French hegemony in North America. Thank you for watching or just listening. Liking this video and subscribing to Mid-Atlantic Chronicles would do a lot for me personally. If you have any thoughts on New France or want to see me cover a topic from Eastern American history that interests you, feel free to leave a comment, and thank you again.